My name is Rachel Bowen. I am the Assistant Director of the Women's Place here at Ohio State. I'm also an Associate Professor of Political Science, and I primarily teach on the Mansfield campus of Ohio State. And with us today are, pardon me, trying to get the right screen up. With us today are Aisha Hardison and Wendy Hesford. Aisha Hardison is Associate Professor in the Department of English and Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at the University of Kansas. She is the author of Writing Through Jane Crow, Race and Gender Politics in African American Literature, University of Virginia Press 2014, and has received fellowships from the Schoenberg Center Scholars in Residence Program, Ford Foundation, and Black Metropolis Research Consortium. Hardison is editor of the multidisciplinary journal Women, Gender, and Families of Color, and co-director of an upcoming 2021 National Endowment for the Humanities Summer Institute on Zora Neale Hurston. Wendy Hesford is a professor of English and an Ohio eminent scholar of rhetoric, composition, and literacy. Her research focuses on the transformative role that critical human rights literacy plays in exposing the violence of representation, revealing hidden, repressed, and silent stories. Her latest book is Violent Exceptions, Children's Human Rights and Humanitarian Rhetorics. It is forthcoming this spring from OSU Press. With that, I'll turn it over to Wendy and Aisha. If anyone has questions, so far we're a pretty small group, so I think you can just put something in the chat that you have a question or even possibly unmute, so.
Thank you, Rachel, for that introduction, and I will now attempt to share my screen. Okay. Do you all see the presentation view, slideshow view? Okay, great. No?
No, we're seeing the, with the sidebar.
Oh, okay, let's see. I'm trying to see if I can both.
Now we can see it.
Have the presentation and my Word document, which it doesn't look like I can. So my Word document is also on my laptop, so apologies for that. But I want to first start, despite that little, but you still see the presentation now, correct?
Yep.
Okay. So sorry about the full view, but I want to start my presentation by first thanking Andrea Williams, the director of the Women's Place, for inviting me to participate in the symposium, Forward Creating Feminist Futures, as well as thanking Wendy for inviting me to collaborate on this presentation about making learning more equitable, education for a feminist future. This first slide should be the overview of, or this next slide is the overview of our presentation and specifically our PowerPoint. So Wendy and I will speak for roughly 15 minutes and we will be sure to leave time for Q&A so that we can address your thoughts and questions about our presentations, as well as engage your ideas about how to make learning a more empowering and equitable process. In my presentation, I take up the breakout sessions invitation to explore whether women's intellectual contributions are still at risk of being underrated. With this aim in mind, I will focus on Black feminist discussion of intersectionality by charting a brief genealogy of Black women's intellectual history, and 2, mapping the contours of debates about the concept. Intersectionality is one of the cornerstones, of Black feminist theory, along with Black feminist development of standpoint theory, their push for self-definition, and their commitment to linking intellectual thought to political activism. Yet intersectionality is perhaps also Black feminists' most well-known contribution to feminist theory. Legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw coins the term intersectionality in her essay, Demarginalizing the Intersection of Race and Sex, which addresses the historical tendency of courts to view race and gender as mutually exclusive. Analyzing three legal decisions that determine Black women could not represent Black men's racial discrimination, represent white women's sexual discrimination, or bring forth a suit specifically on behalf of themselves, Crenshaw demonstrates how Black women have been rendered invisible within the law. Additionally, she points out that this entrenched single axis framework in which race and gender are categorized as exclusive identities and issues has consequence for anti-discrimination law, anti-racist politics, and feminist theory. She concludes, quote, "Neither Black liberationist politics nor feminist theory can ignore the intersectional experiences of those whom the movements claim as their respective constituents." While Crenshaw is credited with creating the term intersectionality, Black women scholars and activists have long been thinking about the ways, quote, "the complexities of compoundedness," to quote Crenshaw, shape Black women's relationship to races and patriarchal structures of power. For example, the Combahee River Collective theorized Black women's multidimensionality by using the terms, quote, interlocking and quote unquote multi-layered to identify their growing consciousness of and organizing around the intersections of race, gender, sexuality, and class. Crenshaw and the Combahee River Collective, among other Black feminist scholars, attribute the theoretical foundation of intersectionality to their intellectual predecessors. For example, Sojourner Truth's interrogating speech, Ain't I a Woman, highlights Black women's exclusion from true womanhood, which is itself a construct in service to patriarchy. Anna Julia Cooper, who writes A Voice from the South, writes, or one of her most infamous quotes or famous quotes are, "Only the Black woman can say when and where I enter, then and there the whole Negro race enters with me." Ida B. Wells, whose investigative reporting on the lynching of Black men exposed white men's policing of white women's sexuality and their disregard of Black women's sexual viability. And finally, Parley Morey, who was also a legal scholar, coins the term Jane Crow to personify Black women's gender oppression and signify on the discriminatory laws and practices encompassing Jim Crow. In fact, just today, a friend sent me the recent viral Time magazine interview with the late US Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, in which she identifies Parley Morey as one of her legal heroes. Ginsburg acknowledges that she was at the right time by writing a brief for a landmark 1970s gender discrimination case, but she states that Parley Morey was ahead of her time. Of course, this brief list is in no way exhaustive of Black feminism's genealogies cohering around intersectionality. Given a long history of intersectional thought among Black feminist thinkers, I decided to foreground them in my graduate course on feminist theory. The graduate course is designed as a survey of contemporary feminist theories produced within and across disciplines. Required for graduate students in WGSS and for the department certificate students, the course can have different emphases depending on who is teaching it. And it is a recurring topic of conversation among my colleagues as developments in the field and growth in my department frequently inspire the course's refinement. Added to this, any survey is a struggle for a professor who attempts to balance the canonical with lesser known yet equally important texts and who works to balance history with contemporary trends. I came to the feminist theory course aware of graduate students' desire for more diversity among the course's assigned readings. Students conveyed this feedback through informal conversations, as well as a faculty-initiated survey. I also came to this course as a scholar of African-American women's writing and literary history, which means I also came to this subject matter thoughtfully questioning what is feminist theory and what could it be? What is its canon? Who are its lesser known key figures? And how do I balance history with contemporary trends? In designing my version of the course, I decided to defamiliarize feminist theory in explicit and implicit ways. I determined one way to do this was to focus on Black women's theorization of intersectionality, which was just one among several feminist keywords on the syllabus, and rather situate Black feminist theory, to focus on intersectionality or Black women's theorization of intersectionality, rather than situate Black feminist theory as a designated unit in the class. I believe this move takes seriously Crenshaw's argument that, quote, placing those who are currently marginalized in the placing those who currently are marginalized in the center is the most effective way to resist efforts to compartmentalize experiences and undermine potential collective action. Moreover, in the midst of a Cite Black Women movement, there is significance in framing intersectionality as an intellectual exchange between Black women for feminist politics and praxis. While focusing on Black women scholars decenters whiteness within feminist theory, I'll also consider what other ways diversifying my syllabus may facilitate students' broad understanding of feminist theory. Therefore, I decided not only to engage intersectionality with my students through Black feminist thought, assigning Crenshaw's essay or the Combahee River Collective Statement, but I decided also to engage the concept through theoretical debate, bringing to my students' attention what has been called the intersectionality wars. In her essay, Rethinking Intersectionality, Jennifer Nash asks a series of questions that challenges our understanding of intersectionality. Her essay credits intersectionality for coming to terms with the legacy of exclusion for marginalized groups. But given intersectionality's long discursive history, Nash contends in the essay, it is time to move the needle, so to speak, in scholars' theorizing of it. Thus, she questions intersectionality's murkiness in terms of method and definition. She also questions, quote, the use of Black women as prototypical intersectional subjects, as she argues against Black women's treatment as a monolithic entity and argues for envisioning new ways to, quote, conceptualize the workings of identity. Toward that end, Nash queries whether intersectionality is solely a theory of marginalization or if it can attend to privilege. Her question, she maintains, pushes the discourse further as she writes, quote, it is incumbent upon intersectional scholars to critically interrogate the goals of the intersectional project as they determine how to chart the future of this theoretical and political movement. Whereas Nash's essay notes intersectionality's institutionalization and assumes its longevity, Brittany Cooper identifies a culture of ambivalence surrounding intersectionality and Black feminist theorists more broadly. In her essay, Intersectionality, Cooper revisits the long history of Black feminist theorizing about interlocking systems of power and oppression, and she clarifies that intersectionality is not an account of personal identities, but structural ones. Invoking the structure of the academy, Cooper also intimates what it means for Black women to retain paradigmatic status within intersectionality studies by, quote, cautioning against any moves to evacuate or relegate to the margins women of color from the intellectual trajectories of their own knowledge production. The consequence of such moves manifests theoretically and experientially for Cooper. She shares in her essay, Love No Limit, quote, when I'm asked in academic context to describe my work, I respond by saying, I am a Black feminist theorist. Almost without fail, my response is met with looks of confusion, eyebrows crinkling into questions, and long awkward pauses as colleagues wait for me to clarify. She goes on to then say, feminist theory names a universe of possibility that Black feminist theory apparently does not. Cooper posits Black feminist theory is regarded as a critical interruption or a theoretical jump off in feminist theory, which frames Black feminist theory and its foregrounding of race as a particularity and fixes it and its foregrounding of Black women as a pastime from which scholars must, quote, move on from in the name of progress. Cooper contends this is especially characteristic of the Academy's demand for the new and innovative. Quote, there is still a significant amount of theoretical and intellectual terrain, she stresses, that we have not sufficiently tilled. In choosing to engage intersectionality as an evolving discourse between Black feminist theorists in my course, as represented by the work of Nash and Cooper, I help diversify feminist theory as well as Black feminist thought for my students. Additionally, I challenge the academic structures of power that continue to negate Black women's theorizing or render Black women scholars invisible. This approach to diversifying the syllabus, which reflexively recognizes debates about Black feminist centrality to studies of intersectionality, broadens students' understanding of what constitutes feminist theory. Further, it defamiliarizes or perhaps demythologizes theory in 4 important ways. 1, it illustrates theories are developed within scholarly communities and that its constituents are not always in agreement. 2, it exhibits that individual scholars expand and refine their theoretical frameworks over the course of their publications. 3, it acknowledges that theory is messy in intellectually productive ways. And 4, it invites students to also consider building, like deconstruction, as an effective critical stance. These points are shared across Cooper's and Nash's works, which convey critical love for Black feminism and its utility for a feminist future. In a love letter from a critic, Nash makes a case for a generative critical demeanor that embraces, quote, the possibility of other ways to be and feel Black feminists within Black feminism's long-standing world-making project. And in Love No Limit, Cooper affirms that theory building is part of, quote unquote, our world making. She asserts that, quote, Black feminism insists that what we build is far more important than what we destroy. Their complementary visions in this regard identify a feminist future as a multi-dimensional intellectual project already in the making within intersectional feminist politics and practice. Thank you. And I will stop sharing my screen.
And I want to invite Wendy Hesford now to share her thoughts. I'll turn it over to her.
Okay, thank you, everyone. I too will share some slides from the PowerPoint, but I do want to just welcome everyone today. Originally, we were going to do smaller breakout rooms if we had a larger group, but now I think we can really just consider this our breakout. So this is going to be perfect for a conversation. I'm going to walk through a few slides very quickly, but then open it up so that we can actually dialogue about potential assignments. So let me do a screen share as well. So what I'm looking at basically is how to use intersectionality as a method of analysis. I'm teaching a seminar in rhetoric, a graduate seminar in rhetoric this semester. And one of the foci for the course is methodology and thinking about how different methods take on different valiances within rhetorical studies and communication studies. So I'm very interested in intersectionality as a rhetorical method of analysis. What you see here on this slide is a wheel, the intersectional wheel that has been developed by a group of colleagues working in public policy. The document itself is called Intersectionality 102, if you were to Google it, and you would see definitions of these 7 categories, as well as some questions. I'm happy to pop that into the chat later on. So I introduced this wheel to my class for us to just think about what goes along with these categories of analysis. And one of the primary analytics for intersectionality, of course, which Aisha also spoke about, are thinking about categories, social categories, identity categories, structural categories. And the idea is that from an intersectional perspective, human lives cannot be reduced to single categories, and that policy analysis or cultural representation, whatever your archive is, cannot assume that any one social category is more important for understanding someone's needs and experiences than another. So intersectionality conceptualizes social categories as interacting and co-constituting one another. So some of the questions that my students came up with, and some of which are also available in the 102 document, are those that I've listed here in the right column. What I want us to do today as a group is to think about the questions as they relate to an analysis of yard signs. So I'm going to move ahead in the PowerPoint and then go back to some of these questions. So here's what I introduced to my class as a quote unquote archive that we could analyze using intersectionality as an analytic. I was very curious about how to read these signs on July 4th. So during the quarantine, I took a ride with my 2 daughters and husband around Columbus, where we live, through downtown, through the various suburbs, etc., and noticed a variety of signs. And what we started to do just as a family, because there was nothing else we could do but go out in our car that day, given social distancing and the pandemic, was to analyze what these meant, these signs on various lawns and in different communities. For example, does the sign Black Lives Matter take on a different meaning when it's in a white affluent suburb across these lavish lawns versus perhaps an area where there's a lot of rental properties, or where there's a more diverse community, or in poorer white neighborhoods, et cetera? Like, how do these rhetorics, these signs, shift depending upon the context in which they appear or are posted? The other question that arose for my family, and this is why I used it as an assignment, ultimately as an assignment in my graduate seminar, was how do we make sense of some of these juxtapositions? Like, what does it mean when I walk down the street in my neighborhood, which is a predominantly white Jewish neighborhood, when I see Black Lives Matter signs on the same lawn as "Thank you, COVID warriors," or on the same lawn as "Thank you to our heroes," or on the same lawn as "Thank you to the Bexley Police Department"? Like, even that juxtaposition alone was baffling to me. Black Lives Matter, thank you, police department, right? Well, one of the things I noticed was that those "thank you to," I live in Bexley Police Department signs, they grew like weeds in this community as soon as there was more attention to the 8 abolition program, the defund the police protests downtown. Right, so now everybody's getting out these signs, and these are existing with these other kinds of signs. The other thing I was interested in is "Thank you, COVID warriors," right? The militarization of the virus. What is that doing to the way we understand the virus? And what does it mean to have that militarization, right, of the virus next to a sign like Black Lives Matter, which is all about the problematic militarization of our communities? So I was just fascinated by these kind of confluences of protest against anti-Black violence in the context of the pandemic. So it was just based on those kind of brainstorms that my family and I had as we wandered through these communities that helped me set up this assignment for my graduate class. So out of these 7 analytical categories on the wheel, there's the category of intersecting categories, or intersecting social identity categories. And so the questions that one might ask using that analytic criteria of the signs might be something like the third question: does the sign, rather than event or text, reproduce a colorblind rhetoric that actually denies intersectional relations? Right? Does it interrogate norms? Does it presume that the solution is the white suburbs? I mean, is that the ultimate goal, that everybody looks like the white suburbs, right? I mean, there are all different readings one could have using that analytic. Multi-level analysis draws our attention to things like the macro levels, global and national level institutions and policies, intermediate levels, local micro levels of analysis. So what does that mean for the signs, right? If we say, how do we apply multi-level analysis to the signs? Well, let's think about the history of restrictive racist covenants in my neighborhood or Columbus as a whole. If you look at this map here, this is a map of Columbus and vicinity from the early 20th century, and it illustrates redlining. The areas that are red surrounding Columbus are those that there was no investment, where people could not get bank loans. These are predominantly African-American neighborhoods, right? The green and blue zones are those where there was a lot of white investment and restrictive covenants, that means housing covenants and policies that restricted the sale of one's property to only white families. You could not sell your property to a Black family. You could not sell your property early in the 20th century to a Jewish family. There are also immigrants that were listed in these restrictive covenants, such as Asians who you were prohibited to sell your property to, right? So discriminatory lending, housing, zoning policies affect who lives in what city, right? And who has access to property, loans, etc. So what does it mean then to take this into account when you see the placement of signs, right? This helps us get at that multi-level analysis of the micro and the macro. So you place the "In this house, Black Lives Matter" sign in a green neighborhood, which is a predominantly white affluent neighborhood. What does that mean for a white wealthy family to make that claim? And how is that different from someone in a red line district making that claim? What I'm suggesting is that intersectionality as an analytic helps us get at those questions. So power is, of course, extremely important to consider when you're doing an intersectional analytic. And what that means, especially if you're taking rhetoric into account, is that you need to look at how power operates at the discursive and structural level, meaning that the words on the signs themselves, right, cognitively maps how we understand something, right, provides the tools, the framework through which we understand. So we might consider, if we're thinking about the signs, to whom is agency or power attributed in this house we believe? Well, who's the we, right? The we is going to change depending upon where that sign appears. Social justice is, as Aisha said throughout her framing, also a core principle for intersectionality. And asking ourselves, what does justice look like in particular spaces? Who can articulate what that might look like? So the assignment itself that I created for students, and I'm hoping we can maybe just brainstorm about, was basically to ask them to think about the signs in their own neighborhoods. Go back to your neighborhood. What do you recall seeing? Think about it, around July 4th in the summer, if you can, right? We had all of these American flags, right? What is the juxtaposition between all the American flags and Black Lives Matter? I mean, to me, so many of these are contradictory symbolic acts, right? So you could say, is that, a kind of naive juxtaposition? Is it a critical juxtaposition, which is trying to show the contradictions and hypocrisy of American democracy? I don't know if that's what my neighbors are thinking. Some might be, some may not be thinking along those lines. What interpretations do the various juxtapositions animate? So I had students start off in their neighborhoods. Then I asked them to think about Columbus, downtown Columbus. And here were some of the murals that were all over the businesses that had closed during the initial part of the pandemic and height of the protests in town, and to think about these also as kind of symbolic signs, not exactly yard signs, but street murals. What kind of meaning do they take on in these various contexts? And then I asked them to, in their last part of their itinerary, so they're going from their neighborhood to downtown, to end up at the former site of the Christopher Columbus statue, where on July 4th, there was Black of July Interdependence Day family celebration. And this was the site where 3 days prior, July 1st, I believe it was, where the Columbus monument was removed from. And so what did it mean then to pull those activists and those goals together? Meaning the kind of anti-colonialist activists with the Black Lives Matter activists. How does that space take on a different meaning when we think about these signs? So what I want to ask us to do just quickly in the next maybe 5 minutes or so before we open up to general Q&A is to just ask you, I mean, how do you read these signs? What did you notice in your neighborhood? And how might intersectionality as an analytic actually help us make meaning of these signs in a way that goes beyond the performance of allyship, that helps us interrogate performative allyship in a way that we really should be interrogating it if we in fact do seek to dismantle, right? Dismantle white entitlement, white supremacy. So let's open it up to questions or thoughts, and we'll be quite flexible, I think, Aisha and I, with regard to what your interests are or questions. So thank you for listening.
So you're welcome to just unmute and share or type it into the chat. I'm happy to kick it off. I'm always happy to kick it off. And just observing, I can't recall the performative patriotism of July 4th that well, but I have been interested to see the quiet war of signs at one end of my block.
Yeah.
Between different campaigns and the Black Lives Matter sign and the one that you showed earlier with the many different in this house, right? Black Lives Matter. And so that's a really interesting, almost aggressive use of these signs. I've found that very interesting on my walks.
I think that's interesting, Rachel, as you point out, the aggressive battle happening at the end of your block between neighbors and the way that they put up signs. And also, I think, Wendy, your question about symbolic allyship is interesting because it could be that someone is aligned with a certain politic, but they're not putting up a sign. So what that makes me think about is the public affirmation that could be superficial or could have a lot of depth, but that the public speech act in and of itself does have power if we see a kind of communication happening between people who put up signs, like some type of debate occurring between people that in the way and what kind of signs they put up and how many signs they put up and how big their signs are.
Yeah, one of the things I was noticing and just getting to be just very honest, increasingly uncomfortable with in my own neighborhood on these walks and drives, being that we're in a pandemic, I'm not going anywhere other than just walking my dog around my neighborhood or maybe driving for takeout. So I'm just starting to really look around even more carefully. And I don't have any of those signs on my lawn. But it's not because I don't share the sentiment. And I'm also not critical of, I don't want to be critical of individuals who have the signs up, because while I don't, and I could talk more about those reasons perhaps, but I know people on my block who are also professors in university, and I happen to know, for example, work very hard and have for years, and these are white faculty, on anti-racist pedagogy, curriculum, and structures. So I could read into their sign, their actions, and know that it's not a superficial expression of white allyship necessarily. But then again, we don't have any of that information about anybody. So when you just drive through my neighborhood, I just wonder, what do people think? Because there's so many more signs here than there are in the poorer neighborhoods surrounding us, or even in the city. So to me, it just seemed so much like, you know, when you move back from the individual, right? I do not want to take away the importance of individuals, particularly white folks, interrogating their whiteness, you know, and looking what they need to do, and the importance of self-reflection. And I don't want to take away that. But also when you just step back and you think about the history of this neighborhood and many neighborhoods and how exclusive they remain, even though there are no longer restrictive covenants, you know, legally binding, they're still at work. And we know that because of the class differences, racial differences that are reinforced, right? Just by issues of access and wealth in our communities. So there's no way really not to see those histories. And what I'm suggesting, right, in terms of intersectionality is that the individual act, whether it's of allyship or support, cannot be separated, cannot be isolated or extracted from those other histories. And that's what intersectionality, I think, you know, at least in part, requires of us. But happy to have questions or just even further observations about signs like, we are all in this together, are we? What do you all think?
I think it's interesting what you, Wendy, were saying, because I'm wearing a T-shirt that says something that one of the signs says, like Black Lives Matters and science is real and all that.
Yeah.
And I did reflect on what it would mean for me, an immigrant, to wear a T-shirt that says Black Lives Matter. So my own personal history is not the history of this country, but I am like a visitor in this country, been here for over 15 years. And so the history becomes my history the longer I stay here. So yeah, so it's like seeing all of the different aspects of this. It's not just a phrase that anyone can grab and use and put on a yard sign. It's the larger context as well. And like, I also live in a wealthy community. So then what does it mean for me, highly educated, with a well-paying job, a stable job, to wear a T-shirt that says Black Lives Matter? Like, what's the...
And you know what you just did, Beatrice, if I'm pronouncing your name correctly?
Yes.
You just did an intersectional analysis right there, I would say. I think you performed an intersectional analysis, you know, in what you just said, right? Because we do need to look at all of these histories, these differences, intersecting social categories.
Right.
One thing I wanted to just maybe even pose to you, Aisha, just thinking about, you know, the history of Black feminism and intersectionality, is this: we are all in this together expression of allyship. When it comes from, or is landed, you know, as a yard sign in a white affluent suburb, one of my great discomforts is that, and critiques just more broadly, not just interpersonally, is that this allyship, or in rhetorical studies, it would be called identification, rhetorical identification, is predicated or parasitic on Black suffering. And that's, I have to say, why I don't have the sign. Just because I'm very, uncomfortable with that piece of it. That my privilege or my signification of Black Lives Matter in this context of my neighborhood, I might say it or wear it in a different context, right? But on my lawn, I think would be an expression of allyship based on white entitlement and white identification with Black suffering. Not unlike, although this might seem a bit of a stretch, but the kind of spectacle of lynching. You know, that the white communion, white solidarity is often predicated on Black suffering and the spectacle of Black suffering. So I don't know if you have thoughts on that, or how an intersectional analytic, you know, helps us get at that.
I'm going to ask Aisha that you wait to answer that, because we're going to be sent back to the main room and pushed back into this room in just about a second.
Not sure where I am now.
You're back in the right place.
I thought we were supposed to be here at 12:12. No, I mean at 2:12.
That was, and I think it started the countdown a little too early.
Oh,
What we've done is to extend it again, and then Shannon will manually stop it when we're ready instead of
okay.
do it by automation. Sorry for that.
No worries. Just wondering.
But I really do like your question there about ways that allyship is based on a kind of predication of Black suffering. And even, I think that Tracer was bringing that up today in noting the ways that her own study about women in anger has been so indebted to Black feminist scholars who've been thinking about anger and who have really different repercussions for how they're able to express that. So that's really useful for you to be able to highlight.
Yes, I wasn't able to attend that keynote, unfortunately, but I will if it's taped. I believe all of this is being taped, right? So we could listen to it.
Correct.
But yeah, I'm thinking more and more about, the Afro-pessimist tradition and what it provides actually as a way of deconstructing white allyship or performative white allyship.
Wendy, I really like your assignment with the signs. And I noticed that both you and Aisha were talking about graduate courses and how you apply intersectionality and use it in graduate courses. I wonder if you could comment, and I would ask Aisha the same thing, but about undergraduate courses, especially really lower level undergraduate courses that at Ohio State are predominantly white and may not be ready to engage with some of the theoretical content, but may be perfectly capable of understanding the implications of that theoretical content.
Yeah, I think, well, the yard sign assignment is probably accessible at any level. I mean, I went around with my daughter who's 16 in the car, right? So she's a high schooler. And she probably, to be honest, I have one senior in college in WGSS at OSU, and the other a high school student. And she had, probably the strongest analysis out of all of us. So my daughters are both Chinese American, so they were bringing that perspective to bear on it, just of feeling othered within their own community and that history. So that could have, facilitated some of their really biting critique of white allyship. But nevertheless, I think it's actually, you could do it at a high school level, something like that. You might have to just, pare down the analytic. Right. So like the intersectionality as a wheel, the questions I think coming from it would have to be made more accessible because there are theoretical constructs embedded in the questions. But I definitely think intersectionality, I think you should introduce it in kindergarten. Just have to make it appropriate for, whatever is accessible to that level. But this is the problem. I mean, that you have to wait till WGSS 101 to get introduced to intersectionality. No, kindergarten.
I thought I had gained some technical skills through the current pandemic moment, but seems like I'm learning new things and being challenged in new ways. So sorry for it taking me some time to rejoin you. I did take note of your question, Wendy. I don't know, it sounds like we've kind of moved past that. But I did want to say that in thinking about connecting with Black Lives Matter, I thought it was interesting, Beatrice's comments about wearing the t-shirt and what does it say. And I do believe that a lot of people participating in Black Lives Matter's protests are thinking about the kind of political consciousness of this moment as intersectional, so that addressing Black lives is also addressing, gender discrimination or immigrant policy or, the invisibility of, police brutality or violence against trans women and trans folk. And so I think people are implicitly engaging intersectionality in that way. But to speak specifically, Wendy, to your comments about support and whether that's always tied to Black suffering and trauma, I also question that. And if we see trauma on one end of the spectrum of emotion and rage at the other, I think it's very difficult and very uncomfortable for people to mobilize around Black rage or Black anger versus Black trauma and Black suffering. And so while I do think people are mobilizing, people with different identities are mobilizing around Black lives based on how they connect those politics to other political movements or broadening their social consciousness, I do think there seems to be limited space for the emotional register of Black people and how that mobilizes non-Black people to support, such causes or movements as Black Lives Matter.
That's actually super clarifying to have and Andrea, you brought that up too, the Black anger piece in there, right? As this continuum of fear for so many white people, where the kind of white response is often resentment at that point, right? White defensiveness or white resentment, thinking about, where the white nation or the white citizen becomes the wounded warrior in that construct, right? We see that at the Trump administration's level, using that concept of victimization, right, of white victimization and resentment. And that's the pedagogical challenge too, Rachel, I think, or one of them. If you're teaching in predominantly white spaces and you're introducing material like this, and I think it will depend and shift depending upon your own identity and visual markers as well. But white defensiveness, is probably one of the major challenges.
And a cap on understanding, right? So that defensiveness seems to put a ceiling on what one can understand, have the capacity to understand.
Or willingness even, yeah.
So we are going to be pushed out of the breakout room again soon, just a couple minutes. So I do want to wrap up. I do apologize for the confusion with the breakout room technology. We are all challenged with the technology in this period. But I do want to, I think there's some really salient points that Dr. Hardison and Dr. Hesford raised, both about pedagogy, but also about the importance of intersectionality and different ways to enter into intersectionality in the classroom. I particularly appreciate the specificity of drawing on Black feminist thinking, and also the really practical sort of advice of the assignment that Wendy Hesford shared, and also the intersectionality 102 wheel. And any other comments that anyone else would like to share before we wrap up, or as we wrap up?
I'm just thanking everyone for being here. I know how difficult successive Zooms can be, especially those of you who've been going all morning. So thank you very much. Thank you, Aisha. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Wendy.